Welcome everyone to Hudson Institute's panel on exploring the effects of Chinese sanctions on members of the European Parliament. I'm happy to be joined today by members of the European Parliament, Mr. Reinhard Butikofer and Mr. Raphael Glucksmann, both of whom have been outspoken in calling out China, particularly regarding the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang. Mr. Butikofer has been a member of the European Parliament since 2009. He is also one of the co-chairs of the European Green Party. He serves as the chair of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with China. He sits on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and is a substitute member of the Committee on International Trade. Mr. Glucksmann has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019. He currently serves as the chair of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation. He is a member of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. In March, both Mr. Butikofer and Mr. Glucksmann were integral in advocating for the joint sanctions implemented by the US, Canada, the EU, and Britain on two Chinese officials who have orchestrated the CCP's genocide of its Uyghur population. In retaliation, China sanctioned several lawmakers and leading academics in the countries involved, including our two panelists today. Thank you so much to our panelists for all of your advocacy and courage and for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Nury Turkel, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, who brought us all together today for a few remarks. Nury, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bethany. Your work as a journalist has helped bring global attention to these atrocities, and we're very grateful that you're here with us today. I'm also delighted to be joined by Mr. Glucksmann and Butikofer, whom I have followed and admired for their principled leadership in defense of democracy and human rights over the years. As Bethany stated, these two gentlemen have been some of the leading voices globally in demanding Beijing to held to account for its genocidal actions. They have refused to be silenced and utilized their platforms to raise awareness to countless audiences around the world. Together, the United States and the European Union have a duty to uphold and champion values such as democratic freedoms and human rights. At the recent G7 meeting, a joint statement called for China to respect rights and fundamental freedoms, especially in relation to Xinjiang. These steps can hopefully prevent or pave the way to continue to have a global action to assert that China's action in Xinjiang and towards ethnic minorities and Hong Kong people and Hong Kong must to come to an end. That said, the words alone will not change CCP behaviors so long as China believes that the United States and countries in Europe are unwilling to take punitive actions. Beijing is unlikely to waver. Luckily, leaders like Mr. Glucksmann and Butikofer are the front of driving this change, are posed to help to shape EU's continuing response. For that, I am profoundly grateful. Over to you, Bethany.
Thank you so much. I will jump right into questions. To start with, let's talk about the immediate reaction of the EU to China's sanctions. One thing that happened immediately was that the comprehensive agreement on investment, which China and the EU had been working on for several years, was put on ice. Can you tell me why that happened and what the implications are going forward for economic relations between China and the EU? And Reinhard, we'll start with you and then go to Raphael.
Thank you, Bethany, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be on this program. I think it should be noted that Raphael and myself maybe are particularly outspoken, but we're certainly not outliers in the European Parliament. We just adopted a resolution on the latest oppressive policies of China in Hong Kong yesterday, and that resolution was adopted with 578 votes in favor and only 29 votes opposed. So that tells you that there is a sizable, a very strong, coherent majority supporting a very critical position vis-a-vis China. And that gives our voice is also additional strength. And members from different political groups are cooperating well to voice pertinent criticism of China's atrocious policies or their aggressive behavior in international relations. So even before they struck at us with their sanctions, there had been a lot of criticism regarding the so-called comprehensive agreement on investment that was pushed through mostly by the German chancellor and the French president just before the turn of the year. For instance, one of the most prominent points of criticism was that this deal did not adequately address the issue of Uyghur forced labor. China has not ratified pertinent ILO conventions against forced labor. And we in the European Parliament have argued many times that we should not sign on to a trade deal without really addressing the issue of modern slavery. And there were other criticisms also. So the going was rough from the beginning. This was not a done deal, even though the leaders pushed for the deal. In the parliament, it met with a lot of opposition. But when China handed down their sanctions, and these sanctions were not just addressing a few individual legislators, we saw them as sanctions against the European Parliament as such. They, for instance, also sanctioned the whole Human Rights Subcommittee, which is a really aggressive step. So we felt, and this view has been supported also by colleagues that were more favorable on CAI than the two of us have been, that no self-respecting parliament would deal with an investment agreement while being sanctioned from the other side. So we had a very substantial majority in the European Parliament to say, we put this in the freezer. This is not going to move forward unless the Chinese turn back and undo the sanctions. And of course, if they would, and I'm not expecting that to happen anytime soon, but if they would, that would not imply that we then say, okay, then let's have the deal. We would return to the substantive criticism that we had been discussing before.
Yeah, I fully agree with Reinhard, and as you will see, it's not the only time I will agree with him, especially on China, but in general, there was always a huge skepticism in the parliament about the China investment agreement. And for obvious reason, slavery, modern slavery for sure, and the fact that this agreement will not address seriously the question of Uyghur forced labor, but also a question of the value per se of the KAI. I mean, do we really need now an investment agreement with China just after the year we have lived through in Europe, when we found out that we were not able anymore to produce masks, medicines, paracetamol? And is it the emergency? I mean, we all know how the KAI was negotiated. It was negotiated for a very long period, but rushed at the end because the German presidency in particular, and Chancellor Merkel, wanted a quick signature. And I'm a member of the International Trade Committee, and already before the Chinese sanction, it was met with kind of skepticism, even from people who are not hostile to have trade deals with China. And right now, it was not a question anymore about the value per se of the KAI, but about, and Reinhard told it perfectly, about self-respect. I mean, how do you want us to sign an agreement, to validate and to vote on an agreement when we are collectively and personally under sanction by the Chinese regime? So this was a clear-cut option taken by the parliament. And I must say that it shows that when you take bold action, and it's quite rare, so we have to note it, when the executive branch of the European institutions are taking bold actions, they can count on a vast consensus and large consensus among the representatives of the people to support this bold action and to encourage them to actually keep on going and making the pressure on the Chinese government grow. Because, as you know, it's not over. I mean, we took sanctions all together with our American allies and other allies, but the situation on the ground, and Nury said it at the beginning, did not change. So if we want really to have an impact, then we will have to go for trade measures and ban the products of slavery from our markets. And on this, the parliament is ready to move, but the big question will be for the member states and for the European Commission. Are we ready to seriously impact the Chinese companies and economy and make the Chinese government think about the situation and maybe revise its calculation of cost and benefits when it comes to the deportation of an entire nation like the Uyghur? Or are we considering that we did our job and with these individuals being sanctioned? And obviously, me and Reinhard and many in the parliament, we consider that we did not do our job yet, and the camps did not close, and the crackdown did not stop. And as long as it goes on, then we have to keep the pressure.
Thank you for that. Raphael, you mentioned consensus, and that is key to how the EU functions and how it chooses to govern. But certain EU member states have been slow to call out China for its actions, and some have even, tried to bar bloc-wide statements. What steps can the EU as a cohesive entity take to effectively address the issue, given that different states have different priorities?
Well, I think you are being nice, because I was speaking about consensus in the European Parliament, but I mean, most of European states have been slow to call out Chinese government's actions. Actually, even my president, as a French, I must say that until 2020, the end of 2020, never even mentioned the name Uyghurs. So it was not slow, it was absolutely absent. And so it's not only Hungary the problem. We have a French issue, we have a German issue too. Clearly, you have in the German apparatus, a strong, in the German government, a strong reluctance on entering into a rapport de force with the Chinese government. And so that's why we come in the European Parliament. We have to put pressure on member states and governments. And as you know, one of the competences of the European Union, per se, the community level, it's trade. And that's the way we should use. I mean, that's the path. If you want to have an impact on Chinese government actions, then you need trade measures. And for me, there is one measure that Europe has to take, and we are working on it. It's the ban of products of slavery from entering into our market. We are still the largest market in the world. And I mean, when we think that we are small and weak and China is a superpower and what can we do? I mean, that's the music we hear in Europe a lot. We should always keep in mind that Chinese companies need our market as much as we need Chinese products. So if you put a ban, then there will be a discussion inside the Chinese government. There will be a new calculation. And for that to happen, we need the parliament to be clear. We need the European institutions to propose plans for that. And then we will need the discussion with the member states, and we will see which member state is blocking. But unfortunately, I don't think it will be only Hungary that's the problem, for instance, or any small nation using its veto because of Chinese interests inside Hungary. Hungary, Greece, or Portugal are not the only country having huge interest in keeping good relation with the Chinese government. You also have that in France and Germany.
Thank you. And Reinhard, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think Raphael is spot on by pointing out that we would be sort of underestimating the challenge if we would just look for one or two nasty veto players. We have a generic issue, as he says, but at the same time, I want to add a more optimistic note, because I feel that the mood is changing. If you look at polling, some polling has been done by Pew and other polling institutions also. They come to the same consistent conclusion. The overall view of Chinese policies has been getting more and more critical all around Europe. In Germany, it's more than 2/3 of the public that hold very negative views of Xi Jinping's China. And that is already showing some impact. But also very interesting is the fact that there is a change of mood in the business community. We just a few days ago had a public statement by the president of the German Federation of Industry. They're representing big multinational corporations, but also thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises. And Mr. Russwurm, this president, said he reminded German businesses that when operating in China, they should watch out for human rights. I haven't heard a German Minister of Economic Affairs making such a statement for at least 20 years. So here, industry is partly ahead of some of the governing politicians. And this is also reflected in measures where European legislators on the European level, including not just the parliament, but also council, have been taking some measures to push back against unfair Chinese trading practices. So the old philosophy of win-win is not dominant anymore. People started understanding that whenever the propagandists of the CCP say win-win, they mean China wins twice. And now there is a stronger will to push back and to defend our own interests and our own values. And that is being felt. And I really see, Raphael mentioned that twice, I really see a very good chance that we could enact over the next year or so, or maybe a year and a half, European legislation that would ban the importation of products of forced labor into our single market, similar to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that has been debated in Congress and pushed by legislators from either side of the aisle. There's a similar situation around Europe, I would say, where we have a lot of consensus over this. And this is transforming also government policies. I would dare predict, because we're having elections in Germany in September, whatever the outcome, the next German government will be much more critical of China than the present government has been.
And since Reinhard cannot say it, obviously, as much as the green score in Germany is high, the more critical the government will be. But that's, I can't say it because I'm not a green, but and you would look like advertising for yourself.
Yes, I wanted to ask a follow-up question on that. I mean, who knows what will happen, but it certainly seems to me that if Armin Laschet is the next chancellor, do you also think that Germany will end up being more critical than it has been? I would be a little surprised by that.
I was thinking of that option, certainly, when I made my statement.
Okay.
And when you look at what happened over, let's say, the issue of 5G and the question whether we should include Huawei in the rollout of the 5G network. The chancellor, if she would have had the government following her will, she would have opened the door to Huawei. In the end, the German Bundestag passed a law that allows future government to close the door to Huawei without naming the company, without naming China. They're basically choosing an approach that is very similar to the approach that the Australians chose in the beginning when they were confronted with this challenge. And but it was enacted against the will of the chancellery because there were also legislators from the conservatives, from the CDU, that were wary of the risks that they felt, just like us, were implied in that kind of a business. And Mrs. Merkel had been successful in the past in some of her China policies. For a while, she was even one of the most outspoken European leaders on human rights when others failed to mention it at all in the public, in the China context, she would. So she has some merit. She managed to get Liu Xiaobo's widow out of China, and she can now enjoy her life in Berlin. So it wasn't all bad, but now over the last years, she fell behind the curve and she lost track. But she did that with high prestige. Her would-be successor, Laschet, and it's not a given that he will govern, but let's assume he would, he does not command the same kind of prestige. And I think it would be a new balance, even if he became the chancellor.
Thank you for that. The next thing that I would like to talk about is Italy. We have talked a lot about forced labor and the questions of whether or not the EU can implement a similar law as has been debated in the US. Italy is now the world's leading importer of products of forced labor tainted products from Xinjiang. What types of mechanisms, both collaborative and, if necessary, coercive, are in place within the EU Parliament and bilaterally between your countries to encourage Italy to disconnect itself from these supply chains?
Well, actually, I'm not sure our countries are in a position to put pressure on Italy, because you also have troubles in our countries. I mean, maybe on a smaller extent, but the same problem you have also in Spain with Inditex. So I don't think that any European country can look at Italy with disdain and contempt, because they are all in the same situation, and that's why it needs to be solved at the European level. I mean, you have two axes for that. You have this ban that we spoke about, and the other thing we are trying to push very hard in the European Parliament, and we already had a vote on that, is the due diligence legislation. The idea of European due diligence legislation is quite simple to understand. It's basically any form of multinational needs to be held responsible of the entirety of its supply chain. So if your Chinese supplier is employing Uyghur slaves, then you will be held responsible for it. And that's a general legislation that we are trying to push very hard, and the Commission is now due to produce a directive on at the very early this autumn. And then we will see if it's ambitious enough, and if it fits the text that we have voted in the Parliament already, then it will be a game changer. Because when we speak to textile, for instance, multinationals and big brands, they are clearly telling us that, well, you know, if you pass this legislation, then we will have to leave China, because we can't control what our suppliers are doing there. And that's why some of them are actively lobbying against this legislation, and that's why also Chinese government is very hostile to it. But that's a consequence of this legislative struggle. And if it passes, then we will have the means to actually clean up both the value chain of our multinationals and the importation of products to our markets. And that's very important. And both of them should be taken at the European level. I mean, there is no French system or German system that will have any form of impact on the Chinese government and on the situation on the ground in China. So that's not an Italian problem, even if it's true that Italy. But on what Reinhard just said before and the end of naivety on the Huawei case, that's true that you have a change of mind in Europe as we speak now. It's not done yet, but there is a positive evolution. I mean, we are basically believing far too long in this idea of that came from the US of end of history. But this myth was really so strong in Europe. We could not imagine that we would have any systemic enemies or adversaries or rivals. And therefore we took a lot of time to even take the measures that will enable us to protect ourselves, not only to have an offensive policy, but just to protect our democracies. And we allowed, as I can speak as the chair of the Committee on Foreign Interference, we allowed both Russian and Chinese penetration in a manner that will make us look crazy for centuries when people will look at how we were handling investment in strategic infrastructure or political financing or any form of foreign interference. And right now, it has stopped. And it's true that it does not depend anymore on specific leaders. Obviously, it's better if you have a leader that's committed to your national sovereignty and security. But in any case, any German or French leader will now have to enact some measures that will be hostile to Chinese penetration.
This idea of change, I think, is really key. And I will say that in my conversations with government officials in the Czech Republic, in Lithuania, and some of these smaller countries that have a very, very vivid memory of what communism as a system is like, it seems to me that some of these states with those experiences have been a little bit earlier to the realization of the concerns and the threat that the CCP poses as compared to maybe Germany or France. What would you say are the larger reasons that there's this ongoing change, even in Germany and France, of how we're viewing China? What are the reasons for that change?
Well, I'm not sure that I would completely agree to the statement you just made, Bethany. We should recall that there has been for the last, 9 years now, this so-called 17+1 format, where 16 and then later 17 East European and Southeast European countries created their own China summit. 17+1 meant 17 European countries plus China. And this was clearly a divide and conquer strategy pushed by Beijing. And it was post-communist countries that mostly fell for that. But the reality is that they are moving away from it now. And they have been disappointed. And now some of them are pushing back very hard. The Polish took the lead in getting it going, and now they're among the more critical participants. The Lithuanians have officially left. So there is a sea change there. The only two friends that China still has in Eastern Europe is Hungary and Serbia. They are outliers in that regard. But what made the change possible in Germany, and Raphael should speak about France. I don't know that much about France, but in Germany, I feel it was a combination of factors. Number one, the more aggressive domestic and foreign policy of the Xi Jinping regime changed a number of minds and opened a number of eyes. When the country followed Deng Xiaoping's motto that you should hide your strength and bide your time, you could still possibly harbor illusions about what the leadership in Beijing might be up to. But with Xi Jinping clearly signaling that he wants China to become the globally dominating power, and that he is willing to export parts of his authoritarian or totalitarian system, and that he's not shying away from open aggression, be that on the Himalayan front with India, be that in the South China Sea around the Senkaku Islands, or vis-a-vis Taiwan. I mean, people see that, and people understand that it is the character of this regime that is driving the relation, and that is changing the relationship. And there was also, in addition to that, an economic change, I would argue. For a long while, Germany had a very favorable economic relationship with China because we were able to export to China all the high-tech products and the luxury cars that they craved, while China exported to us the low-priced commodities. And that was a good deal for either side. There was almost no competition. But as China started moving up through the value chain more and more, China became a competitor, not just a customer, a competitor. And the fact that they were not playing by the rules became more relevant when they were in direct competition with our own businesses. So that gained more relevancy. And I would say, as Chinese engineers started trying to eat German engineers' lunch, German politicians were forced to become more European, because Germany could not anymore rely to that degree on its own privileged relationship with China. We had to realize, and I think business is doing that, realize that we don't have a spoon that is long enough to continue to eat from the same bowl with the Chinese forever. Either we use a European spoon, and that is, we do China policy together, or we will go hungry. This is what has changed.
Yeah, once again, I agree. In France, it's slightly different, because I would not say that there was naivety on the internal security front. I mean, French have a tradition, of very divided administration. Basically, internal services and internal security people were always very cautious on the Chinese penetration and Chinese influence, and the same with Russia, by the way. While foreign policy people and trade people were much more naive in their approach. And what happened is that first, the first part, I mean, the security people won the debate because of the growing security risks, and it became obvious that you had a huge trouble. And the second thing is what Reinhard just said. I mean, it became clear that, well, if things were going on like that, then the relationship will be like too much in favor of China, and soon we would not be able to cut any form of deals. We would just be vassalized by the Chinese regime. But I would not say that we are there yet, because as we have seen 2 days ago, with the call of Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Xi Jinping, you still have this tendency in France, in Paris and Berlin, to deal directly with China without consulting with European institutions and their European neighbors, and to have a dream of some kind of direct honeymoon with big powers without going through the European system. And this is quite dangerous. And Chinese government is playing on that from the start. I mean, it's exactly the same strategy as Putin. It's we want to deal with Paris and Berlin, and we don't want to deal with Brussels, and we want to deal with Budapest directly or with Vilnius, but we don't want to deal with Brussels. And why they do that? Obviously, because it's so much easier to deal with the divided Europe and with every single member state per se. And that's something that we have to work on in Paris and Berlin, because obviously both Merkel and Macron did not totally understand the message coming from us.
I wanted to read a quote in the context of Xi Jinping leading China in a more aggressive direction, and how that may be alienating governments, especially in democratic countries. This is from a speech he gave on July 1st, and which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it demonstrates really viscerally the tone that Xi is now setting. The Chinese people will never allow foreign forces to bully, oppress, or enslave us. Whoever nurses delusions of doing that will crack their heads and spill blood on the Great Wall of Steel, built from the flesh and blood of 1.4 billion Chinese people. I don't think that kind of language is winning him very many friends.
But is he looking for friends in Europe? I'm not sure. He's looking for people who are lacking the courage to confront him. And this kind of speech can also be, I think it has counter effects and counter impact, and that it's actually playing for a tougher approach on the Chinese government. But you also have people who are quite reluctant to be bold when you shout at them and you speak about crushing their head. So that's their calculation. Maybe it's hubris, and it will cost the Chinese government a lot. But let's see on the long term, because what I see sometimes is that after the counter sanctions from Beijing, everybody was playing the tough guys in Europe, saying, "Well, we won't give in. We are strong. We are not impressioned by tyrants and everything." But like 2 weeks after, some people were starting to ask themselves, did we go too far? Maybe, we infuriated these big guys, and are we sure we want to keep the relation this way? And maybe it's time now to come down and go back to the table, while nothing has changed on the ground, and while Uyghurs are still in camps, and women are still sterilized, and people are still enslaved. So basically, it's a double-edged situation, and we will see. And that's why I'm always saying it's not about our relation with China. In fact, it's about who we want to be. Are we going to stand up for our own principles and our long-term interests, or are we going to forget about them and give in to the bully guy? And this is not about just China. It's about Europe. Are we ready to be adults or are we opting for a destiny of vassals and consumers? That's a choice we have to make about ourselves.
I would first of all agree with Raphael. This is not necessarily shaped for a European audience. It's certainly mainly for a domestic audience. And when you look back 100 years, China was in a semi-colonial state, and today China is the second most powerful country in the world. So for a nationalist propaganda, that is obviously a theme to harp upon. But I don't think it's just a domestic audience to which he speaks. I get the impression that China also tries to use such quasi-anti-colonial, quasi-anti-imperialist language to present themselves as global leaders against the old industrialized OECD countries, the old elite. And China is trying to portray the course that Xi Jinping is devising as the rise of the rest against the West. And in that regard, I think there might be a more favorable reception, maybe in some countries along the global south than there would be in Japan or Korea or Austria or Australia or Germany or the US. And I think we have to not just look at the triangle between Beijing and Washington and Brussels or other European capitals. We also have to look at what are we going to have on offer for the rest of nations that don't just want to be taken as objects of big power competition, that want to have their own, to play their own role, to have agency, to have a voice. And I think in order to push back against China's aggressive course, we have to offer other countries a better deal. So China exploited our mistakes and our weaknesses where we did not make good enough offers with regard to, let's say, infrastructure development by utilizing that to roll out their Belt and Road Initiative. I recall a conversation with the Minister of Finance from Indonesia, who, when she was asked about what she thought of Belt and Road, said, well, give me an alternative and I'll tell you what I think about it. And now we're in the process of developing such an alternative. At the G7, when President Biden proposed the Build Back Better World Initiative, that was a step in that direction. The European Parliament passed a resolution on connectivity strategy in January that also goes in the same direction. I think we should pay attention to that part of the international arena, and maybe we're not doing enough of that. I have heard many voices from outside China that have reported that China is asking countries, okay, so what does the rules-based international order do for you? And we may not honor the rules-based international order, but maybe you will have more benefits. So China is offering a vassal status to countries by trying to exploit feelings of other countries, and we should pay a very good attention to that. So, yeah. So there's a challenge for us to not just form an anti-China front, but a positive alliance to solve the challenges, to solve the issues of international justice, to solve issues around climate change.
Yeah, and if you look at vaccine, I'm not sure we totally understood you, because I mean, at the global leaders stage, because right now, every time we are missing an opportunity to have a clear solidarity agenda at the world stage, we will open the gates for China. And that's something that we should keep in mind. There is no way we can remain as islands. And when you are dealing with a global pandemic, then, I mean, our lack of solidarity and our lack of solidarity, for instance, in terms of vaccination in the south, in the southern world, this is what is opening the gates to the Chinese system. And we have to understand that, well, if China brings in some infrastructure, solidarity, and at the same time tells local elites that they will not be bothered about human rights and rule of law, then most probably they will win the game. And if we just come in with be careful about rule of law, but we have nothing to offer as perspective, then there will be a growing tendency to bet on us being out, for instance, of Africa. And this is really a defining moment, and that's, you know, I mean, we were told that we will not have systems in front of us that would be coherent enough to challenge the liberal democratic domination of the world. Well, that's over. I mean, we have one, and it's actually performing well, and that's the bad news. That it's actually not a fake system. For a large part, Soviet Union was based on lies and fake news. Well, it's not totally the case of the Chinese regime. They have shown that without embracing any form of democracy, you can take out hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and you can develop countries. And this is very challenging for us, because it's contrary to everything we have learned in our schools. I mean, when I was a student in political science, I was told that, well, you know, when you start to have a growing economy, then you have a middle class, then naturally you crave for democracy, then you have progress of human rights. So basically you open up your system to trade, then it becomes a liberal democratic. Well, what we have seen is that you can open up yourself to trade, you can actually have a growing middle class and be more and more and more nationalistic and autocratic. And so basically we should give up on all the thinking of the 90s and restart to approach the world as a competition of philosophical systems. And this time, I mean, every lack of solidarity we are showing, every lack of perspective we are showing, it's something that will be embraced and that will benefit the Chinese ambitions.
Thank you for this incredible discussion. I'll ask one final question, and then at the end, Nury will close up the session for us. So I'd like to ask, and both of you have already touched on this, but I hope to hear some specific, hopefully, ideas. How can the US and the EU work together to, as you've both said, present and root for our model, and to engage with China in a way that doesn't repeat the same mistakes that we've been making for the past 3 decades?
Let me start with just 3 fast points. Number one, based on an initiative from the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Policy, Mr. Josep Borrell, the US government and the EU have agreed on starting a transatlantic dialogue on China. And this is going to be a multifaceted dialogue. And there is a format now for the conversation. That's very positive. And I would say there are 2 issues that I would emphasize a lot. Number one, what I already went into a little bit, devising an alternative, a substantial alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, which would bring in the private sector, which would follow a different philosophy, a philosophy of sustainability and transparency and accountability, other than China, but that could offer a real developing options to international partners. And I know that the Japanese, the Indians, and many others would be eager to join forces. The second priority that I would identify is working together in international organizations, in particular multilateral organizations. This starts with the WHO. It touches upon the WTO. It should address international norming organizations where the Chinese are trying to make headway and to turn the norming world, the standardization world, into a nationalist perspective. We should team up to push back together against that.
Yeah, and I will just add to that if you want to have a cooperation, and if we want us to be successful, let's let's be fair and let's be just, which means that we need to have a common agenda for progress. I mean, we cannot just have a defensive cooperation against China. And as Reinhard said before, I think that we should have common projects that will be challenging China's ambition, but that will be universal. I mean, again, let's do together this due diligence agenda. Let's clean up the supply chain of our multinationals. Basically, you have companies, American and European, that benefited a lot from this last 30 years of all the production moving to China, us becoming more and more dependent to the Chinese production apparatus, and having their supply chains tainted with slavery and forced labor. So let's clean our company's supply chain, and it will have an impact on China, but that we can do together. And basically, the globalization as it stands now, it's not to our benefit, and it's not certainly to the benefit of human rights. So let's change it together. And this is why it's so interesting not to have only a discussion with the US on China, but a general discussion on what should change. Because if you keep seeing that it is going, not only will have a catastrophe in terms of climate, but you will have a Chinese domination. So now let's change it and let's do it together. So I think we should have a positive agenda of reforms, and that will make us stronger, including when it comes to dealing with other countries.
Thank you for joining us today. This has been an illuminating conversation. We get this question a lot, if it's working, all the sanctions and the policies been announced, has been working. We should not have any illusion that it will be easy to alter the Chinese government's behavior, whether in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or Tibet. The Beijing, by design, will unlikely to ever admit it is feeling the heat, or there has been enough cost to their interest. As a result, they're changing policies. And to this day, the Tiananmen Square massacre has not been publicly admitted, officially admitted as a mistake. So we should not waste time assessing if it's working in China. It's working. Just one example, one of the major suppliers by the name Huafu publicly stated that they are losing money as a result of the US sanction and companies canceling out contracts. So, this is a long journey. If the United States and our traditional allies and partners come together, properly coordinate as we have in the last few months, we can make a difference. And we start seeing the change in the tone, at least from the Chinese government official statements. If the government says we need to create a lovable image, we need to work on our narrative and calling everyone else's liar and going after politicians like yourself, legislators like yourself, who are defending human rights, defending democratic freedoms. That shows that your work, your leadership is been noted in Beijing. So we need to continue what we have. It should not take a genocide of Uyghurs to wake up. It should not take upending of Hong Kong democracy for the world community, international community, to wake up. But this is what we have now, so we have to tackle it. So the CCP presents, as quoted by Bethany earlier, a daunting challenge that few countries have been willing to take. I commend you. I appreciate your leadership, Raphael and Reinhard, to take up this mantle and lead the effort. We need more leaders like yourself. I'm confident and I'm cautiously optimistic that like-minded individuals and leaders around the world, we can put to an end and can say no genocide, no polluting of global supply chain with enslaved labor, and horrible oppression must stop. Hudson's door is always open. We'll welcome you back, and these conversations, these topics need more than just one event. And thank you again for your leadership. Thank you for taking the time to join us in today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.